All right. Okay, so chapter 10, a lot of this material is going to sound familiar because we have been doing activities that had to do with chapter 10. So we all need to realize that no matter what we do, we have impact and we utilize land. Even if you're not a farmer, you still have a cost on land, right? You still have your stressors that are affiliated with land. We all eat, right? Our food comes from somewhere. You may not be gardening yourself. You may not be raising your own cattle and your chickens that you will eat later on, but we still get our food from somewhere. And if you remember The Biggest Little Farm, I know it seems like we watched it last year, which we did. But we did it at the beginning of last unit, right? And think about how much impact that farming had on the land that was considered dead, okay? So people don't always agree on what's best and what's the reasonable way to utilize land. So we need to think about three different things that correlate with each other, and we'll look at each of them here individually. Tragedy of the commons. If you remember the lab that we did fishing for fish, it takes effort and it takes communal effort to maintain a population of common goods. Okay. Hardin has brought this idea of us overusing common resources, which will eventually lead to depletion or ruining of whatever that common resource was. When too many people have their hands in the pot, they are going to become competitive. They will want to make sure that there's enough for them, but they also become judgmental. Well, if so-and-so took that much, I want to take that much too. Why does so-and-so have more than I do? So that's where your tragedy of the commons stems from. When you have a common pasture, for example, and you have the ability to put your grazing animals on that pasture, you know, if you are the one that has just 2 sheep on that field, but then the other farmer that has also access to that field puts 7 sheep in there because they think, well, there's enough grass and resources to support that population. Well, now you with your 2 sheep will want to also put more sheep on that pasture, right? Because if farmer B can put that many on there, why can't I? Well, if we don't maintain how many animals we can put on that pasture, we are going to overgraze that pasture and eventually lead to this collapse. That collapse of that resource is known as the tragedy of the commons. Okay. Externalities are ones that are not necessarily fulfilled or calculated within the cost of the product. The example that the book gives you is of a bakery that's nearby your home, and the benefit of you waking up to that smell of freshly baked pastries and donuts and bread has a positive impact. It has a positive thought that's being placed in your head, right, about that product, about that company. Now, if that company, if that bakery has trucks coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning every morning, and you have those beeping noises of trucks backing in and pulling in and loading and unloading and people working, that's going to make you angry, right? You're going to be woken up every morning and you're going to be cranky. Now you're going to be feeling negative feelings towards that bakery, even though they may carry the best pastries in town, right? But that's the cost of them doing business, is that they're made you angry and you may not want to shop there because they wake you up every morning. Now, when we think about the maximum sustainable yield, we need to think about what is the maximum amount of renewable resource that can be harvested without compromising the future of that resource. Think about the Easter Island, right? When they were living on Easter Island and the population was small and they were harvesting their trees at a reasonable rate, they allowed for those trees to replant, to regrow, etc. Now, it was a combination of a couple of things. They went in and they started clear cutting the palm trees. But there also was evidence of rodents arriving on, most likely on a canoe or somebody's ship. And now the rodents were responsible for eating the seeds, right, of those palm trees. So the palm trees didn't have enough time or seeds that would allow for the trees to grow up. If you think about the Lorax, right, there was a combination of all of those things. You have the tragedy of the commons where the Onceler went in and clear cut all the forest, right? They cut all the truffula trees. Well, at this point, if you don't have enough seeds or time to regrow that forest is gone, right? And that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit here when we discuss the different forestry methods. So for your maximum sustainable yield, if you think about hunting for example, I know hunting in Illinois and Wisconsin for deer is regulated where there's a number of tags that you can purchase for your deer. Because you cannot allow people just to go in and free deer hunt for an unlimited amount of animals. That would lead to a collapse of that population. Even though there might be, 50 deers left over in the big forest, well, chances of these 50 deer coming across each other and mating are much lower than if we control the population by the number of individual animals that can be hunted. Okay, so that's why they don't have the free-for-all hunting methods, right? So you need to go in and, like I said, purchase your tags and actually hunt just a certain number of animals. So we have, on a global scale, there's a lot of public lands and marine environments that people have access to. And they vary from place to place, right? I would assume that just looking at this map, you should be able to figure out like, oh yeah, I can see why this area might be set aside, right? You should be able to tell that there's probably a good reason why this marine environment of the coast of Australia is protected, right? I shouldn't have to tell you what's over there. So there are different categories for public lands that are managed by different nations. National parks are ones that most people are very familiar with, right? And those are set aside for scientific purposes, for recreational purposes. So you can go camping, you can go hiking, you may get some scientific permits to go and do some research stuff. For the most part, national parks are set aside in areas that have something unique in terms of landforms or nature. We have Glacier National Park, right, that have those glaciers that may not exist in 30 years' time. We have some managed resource protected areas that might be used for mineral resources. So some limited mining permits might be issued in those areas. There might be some biological research studies, etc. And of course, you can use it for recreational purposes. When you have habitat and species management areas, those are set aside specifically to maintain a certain population or species of animals or plants. oftentimes those are not, public is not generally allowed to go into those areas. Okay, because if they're trying to protect a specific species of plants, they don't want a bunch of people going in and hiking and, you know, pulling flowers and whatnot. So we also have some strict areas, which are nature reserves. Then again, that are set aside to protect specific species and or ecosystems. When you have protected landscapes and seascapes, those will allow for some tourism to take place, but it needs to be a non-destructive way. And then national monuments are ones that are either a cultural value or natural interests. This is a map which shows you the areas of public lands in the United States. And just looking at this map, you can tell how exciting Illinois and Iowa are. There's really not much around here, right? Most of the public lands that are in the United States are located on the west part of the country. Okay. There is a couple of ideas when it comes to land management that people will follow. Okay, the resource conservation ethic tells you that people should utilize the land, but they should also maximize the use and minimize the use of resources in order to prolong the life of that land. Okay, so we want to avoid the tragedy of the commons. We have a classification for land that can be used, and you know, I'm sure you're familiar with permits or zoning that are oftentimes listed on different properties, where some can be residential, some might be multi-use, some might be business zoning. So depending on how the county is determining how many businesses they want to have running in a certain area, can they allow businesses to run in the middle of a subdivision, right? They may not want a nail salon in somebody's basement in the middle of a subdivision, right? Because that would be a multi-purpose type of permit. So this slide here has some missing information on it. So the red part, and I actually had to look it up because I will have the grasslands. So about a third of our land in the United States is set aside for grasslands. Okay. The blue part, again, a third of that land is going to be forested areas. The purple one, that's the last one that's missing, that would be a recreational purposes. Okay. So that's pretty much how we split the public and private land in the United States. There are many different agencies that oversee the use and management of land in the United States. And you guys can look through here. Obviously, if you want to have a mining permit or a logging permit, you would go to appropriate agency to pull those permits. Okay, so land or Module 30 will talk about different types of management techniques of land. And those will differ depending on what type of land cover you have, right? Are we talking about forested areas? Are we talking about rangelands, etc.? Rangeland is going to be an open grassland that's primarily used for cattle, for raising cattle, right? So that's where your tragedy of the commons might become very dominant, right? When you have farmers that will put their animals on that rangeland. When we were in South Dakota last summer, I saw that they have literally in the public lands, they had the farmers had fences, and then they would put their cattle in the mountains and they would just graze, right? But they were still limited on the number of cattle that they can put in certain area of land. Because if you have too many grazing animals, right, you're going to deplete the amount of plants that are able to grow, therefore ruining the entire future of that grazeland. There are a couple of different ways that we can manage forested areas and a couple of different methods of harvesting trees. When we talk about clear cutting, that is the most destructive way of logging. It's also the cheapest way to do it. So a lot of companies will go for that method, right? It's the cost versus benefit idea. Clear cutting, it's pretty much when you go in and you cut every single tree in your path. It doesn't matter if the tree is big enough to be used for lumber, if it's a baby tree, if it's a species that you may not necessarily care for, they go in and they cut everything. When you do selective cutting, that's where you would have a forester or worker from that logging company go in and tag trees that can be cut, leaving most of the trees behind to allow for reseeding. So in the top part of this image, we go in and we clear cut everything in that forest. The trees that will grow in that place are all going to be the same age and most likely all going to be the same species. So you lose that biodiversity within that ecosystem. When you go in and you do selective cutting, you leave some young trees, some middle-aged trees, and some mature trees to provide that ecosystem still for whatever the animals are living in that place, but also allowing for reseeding and sheltering that area from soil erosion, for example, right? Because when you remove all the plants, you remove all the roots of those plants, there's no roots to hold on to that topsoil. If you have big rains or windstorms come through, soil erosion is a big problem. The ecologically sustainable forestry is a way to think about removing trees from forests in ways that will not affect the viability of, or other non-commercial tree species. So if you want to go in and cut all the pine trees, you might want to leave all the oak trees behind, right? Or if you want to cut all the oak trees, well, you may not care about the poplar trees that are there. So a lot of companies, a lot of permits will require companies to provide a plan for reforestation. And unfortunately, that's where you have those forests that are planted, that are in perfect rows. You have one species of trees. And we talked about it when you guys read the Truax. It's not the same, right? If you clear cut a forest, you are not going to have owls living in that forest. You are not going to have many deer or black bears living in that forest because that's not an environment that's suitable for them, right? So they are going to either go extinct or move somewhere else. So oftentimes, logging companies or land management people are going to go in and they are going to do prescribed burn. Prescribed burn is actually a preventative measure to prevent big forest fires that occur naturally from happening. Okay. There was a huge forest fire back in the 80s in the Yellowstone, where majority of the park was engulfed in flames. The Smoky Mountains near Gatlinburg were they had a really bad forest fire, I want to say in maybe 2008, 2010, right around then, where they had a ridiculous amount of forest fires all around Gatlinburg. I want to say they had like 3,000 homes that burned within that Gatlinburg area, which was very devastating for that community. So like I said, national parks are used for both recreational purposes as well as scientific use. Oftentimes in national parks, you will be reminded to leave no trace behind and to only take memories and to only take pictures, right? They don't want you removing plants or rocks or fossils or anything else you might find in a national park, because it's there for a reason, right? Wildlife refuge and wilderness areas are public lands that are set aside with the main purpose of protecting wildlife. Okay. Please don't call them refugees. They're not national wildlife refugees. They're refuges. Okay, you can read through the regulations. I'm not going to really focus too much time on those. The one thing that you should be familiar with is going to be the last one, the Endangered Species Act. It was designated or designed, I should say, to protect species that are in danger of going extinct. There are different ways that we can identify land. A suburb is going to be a land area that surrounds metropolitan areas, so like all the suburbs around the city of Chicago, right? An exurb is going to be one that's similar to a suburb, but it does not is not attached to a central city. Okay. Since the 50s, a lot of people have moved away from the city and into the suburbs, right? If you think about the typical 1950s American dream type of environment, right? You have a little house, you have your little suburban yard with a white fence. That's kind of what drove people into the suburbs. Now, there has been also movement earlier on of people to move into the cities because of jobs, right? So a lot of people moved from rural areas to the city for jobs. Well, now, in the 50s, now people had means of transportation, so they could commute from the suburbs to the city if they needed to. An urban sprawl is going to happen when we have urbanized areas move outwards and kind of absorb more and more rural areas. There's a couple of reasons why that happens. Number one, like I said, people have the means of commuting, right? People have access to cars, to trains. They can, from Elburn, you can hop on the train and be downtown Chicago for your job in about an hour, right? The living cost might be better than living downtown. And urban blight is a very interesting way of looking at the change in population, and then I'll talk about it in just a second. And then there's the government policies, right? That some areas might be better off. So urban blight is kind of related to that food desert that we talked about last week, right, in South Central LA. What happens is you have population that shifts from urban settings, so from the city, and they move to the suburbs. Well, now you have decrease in tax income for that city because you have people moving away, leaving vacant lots and vacant apartments behind. So nobody's paying taxes on those properties. So the city is decreased. So the city is experiencing a decrease in income. Well, if they don't have income, they are going to cut things that they can cut, right? For example, they might no longer take care of parks. They may not, have buses running into that area. Well, if you live in the area that now the government is not maintaining that area, well, now you're going to have more people moving away because nobody wants to live in a crappy neighborhood, which will have this snowball effect. Well, now you have even more people leaving, so you will have more abandoned lots, less income in terms of taxes, so that vicious cycle continues, right? You have this positive feedback loop. So I talked briefly about zoning, right? That there are different types of permits and zoning for different properties that might separate industry from residential areas. Because like I said, nobody wants to have a body shop in their neighbor's driveway, right? Where they go in and they repair cars and they go in and they paint cars. And, here you thought that you're moving into a suburban type of neighborhood in a subdivision where you wouldn't expect that. So that's where the zoning comes into place. Okay. Again, the induced demand will cause congestion and urban sprawl, because the more people are moving out into the suburbs, right, you're going to have that bigger sprawl of suburban neighborhoods, which is going to lead to an increased traffic congestion, because now all those people have to commute to work, right? You're gonna have longer commutes, more gasoline that's being used because of those longer commutes. Therefore, you're going to have an increased tax revenue for those purchases of gasoline. Well, that will ultimately lead to more need for road construction, right? That's going to utilize those tax revenues because of the increased usage and whatnot. So you will have, one of the options is to have a smart growth plan, meaning that you would think about how do we mix the use of land, residential versus parks versus forest preserves, right? That may limit that commute, the number of people that need to commute via cars. Create neighborhoods and plan neighborhoods that are very bicycle friendly and walking friendly. Okay, and if you think about where we live and thinking about Canelan High School, this is not a type of community that's bicycle friendly, right? I would love to have my kids have the option to ride their bike to school, but I'm sorry, I'm not sending my kids on a bicycle down 47. Like, that's just not an option, right? So, the community has to have a plan to accommodate. Now, if you live in Blackberry Creek and your kids go to school at Blackberry Creek, chances are they're gonna ride their bikes, right? Because you're in a neighborhood that will allow that to happen. Okay, take advantage of building designs that will allow that to happen, right? That will allow those populations to live together and correspond, or not correspond, but commute in a smart way. And then finally, create communities that will fulfill this, what they call the sense of place, right? That's meaningful, that's valuable to you as a human being, that you want to stay here and raise your family and not move away in 10 years because you hate it. Okay. And this is our last slide here. You might want to make sure that you have any vacant lots that are left behind, that they're actually utilized. Think about, I always think about that picture from South Central LA of that vacant lot that's just surrounded by a chain link fence that could easily be utilized for a park or even just green space, right? Plant some grass, have kids play soccer and you know, run around in that space. But yet by putting this chain link fence around it, you're setting a tone for that block, right? You have a different vibe of that neighborhood because of that chain link fence. Like I said, plant some grass, have somebody from the city mow it, and it's going to have a completely different feel for that area. Okay, and that would be all for chapter 10.